December 18, 1944, 14:35 hours, 8 kilometers east of Bastogne, Belgium. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Hoffmann lay in his freshly dug foxhole, surrounded by 20 soldiers of his platoon, watching through the snow-laden air as the dark forest loomed ahead. 2 weeks ago, they had been promised the decisive breakthrough to Antwerp, the Reich's final chance to reverse the war in the West. Yesterday, his men had captured an American supply depot containing 50,000 gallons of fuel, more than his entire division had consumed in a month of fighting on the Eastern Front. Hoffmann felt victory's proximity, believed in German tactical superiority, in the discipline and experience of his soldiers who had survived Kursk, Kiev, and the Dnieper. Then came the artillery barrage, but not a normal one. The first shell did not explode upon hitting the ground. It detonated in midair, precisely above his men's heads, approximately 20 meters above the surface. Hoffmann heard no warning whistle of an incoming projectile because the shell traveled faster than sound. Just a sudden blinding flash, then a metallic rain of shrapnel tearing through the foxhole from above, where there was no protection. 3 soldiers dead instantly, 4 wounded, bleeding out at the trench bottom, from an explosion that occurred where there was no visible target for detonation. Gefreiter Schmidt, pressing himself against the frozen earth with face white from terror, whispered, "Herr Oberfeldwebel, the shells, they're exploding above us. How do they know where we are?" Hoffmann had no answer, and this frightened him more than the bombardment itself. Through 3 years of continuous combat on the Eastern Front, he had grown accustomed to Soviet artillery strikes, brutal, massive, wasteful in their scale. But those shells always exploded upon impact with ground or obstacles. You could take cover in a foxhole, wait it out, survive. This was different. This was impossible, something that contradicted every law of warfare he knew. A second shell burst in the air above the neighboring platoon, a third, over positions to the left. Each detonated with demonic precision at optimal altitude, transforming the protective forest into a death trap where no sanctuary existed, where every foxhole became a grave open to lethal fragments from the sky. The Americans had created a weapon that destroyed the very concept of cover, the fundamental basis of infantry tactics that had defined warfare for centuries. For the first time in 3 years of war, Klaus Hoffmann, who had held positions against Soviet armor at Prokhorovka, who had fought house to house in Kharkov, who had survived the Dnieper crossing, felt something he had never experienced before. The absolute certainty that he was fighting an enemy that possessed technology beyond his comprehension, beyond his ability to counter. If they can make every shell know where to explode, Hoffmann thought, watching his men die around him from invisible detonations overhead. If every American artillery piece can strike us in our foxholes, through our cover, without warning, then how can we possibly fight this war? What good is courage when the enemy's shells are smarter than we are? This was the nightmare the Wehrmacht had refused to imagine, that the Americans, whom German propaganda had dismissed as inexperienced soldiers with good equipment but no real fighting spirit, had mastered something far more deadly than fighting spirit. They had industrialized intelligence itself, created weapons that could think, decide, and kill automatically. The 4th shell exploded, the 5th, each one a precise airburst 20 meters above ground, each one claiming more lives. By 1500 hours, Hoffmann's platoon of 40 men had been reduced to 12 effective soldiers. The Americans had not even begun their ground assault yet. They were simply erasing German defensive positions with mathematical efficiency, using artillery shells that refused to play by the rules of conventional warfare. And somewhere in Hoffmann's mind, beneath the terror and the death screaming around him, a terrible realization began to form. Germany had brought tactical brilliance and combat experience to a technological war. America had brought proximity fuses. Is charged, 1940. Carnegie Institution of Washington, District of Columbia. Dr. Merle Tuve stared at the specifications that seemed to mock the laws of physics. Create a radar system small enough to fit inside an artillery shell, no larger than a pint milk bottle, capable of surviving acceleration forces of 20,000 times gravity, spinning at 25 to 30,000 revolutions per minute, functioning reliably across temperature ranges from -40 to +140 degrees Fahrenheit, and costing little enough to manufacture by the millions. Every traditional engineer said it was impossible. Tuve, a physicist who had spent the previous decade exploring nuclear physics and cosmic rays, looked at impossible and saw only a problem that required unconventional thinking. Britain was losing the Battle of Britain. Germany controlled continental Europe, Japan threatened the Pacific, and Allied anti-aircraft defenses were catastrophically ineffective, requiring an average of 20,000 shells to destroy a single enemy aircraft, a hit rate of approximately 0.005%. The mathematics of attrition warfare were simple and brutal. At current effectiveness rates, the Allies would lose the war before they could train enough gunners or manufacture enough conventional ammunition to matter. The concept of a proximity fuse, a shell that could detect its own target and detonate automatically at optimal range, had existed theoretically since World War I, but the engineering challenges had defeated every attempt at practical implementation. Traditional mechanical time fuses required gunners to estimate target altitude, speed, and trajectory, then manually set the fuse to detonate after a specific flight time. In combat conditions, against maneuvering aircraft, this approach produced the dismal statistics Tuve was now tasked with overcoming. His solution was revolutionary. Compress a miniature radio transmitter and receiver into the nose of an artillery shell. Use the shell's metal body as an antenna to emit continuous waves at approximately 180 to 220 megahertz, and design circuitry sensitive enough to detect the Doppler frequency shift when those waves bounced back from a target. When return signal strength exceeded a predetermined threshold, indicating the shell had closed to within 70 to 75 feet of the target, the fuse would trigger detonation automatically. The shell would become the world's first smart weapon, a projectile that could see, decide, and kill without human intervention after being fired. The technical obstacles were staggering. Every component had to be miniaturized to fit within a volume smaller than a coffee cup. Vacuum tubes had to survive forces that would instantly crush conventional electronics. The entire system had to function reliably, despite violent spinning, extreme temperatures, moisture, and the electromagnetic chaos of combat. And it had to cost little enough for mass production, because a secret weapon you could only afford to build in small numbers was just an expensive curiosity. Tuve drove his team with an intensity that bordered on fanaticism. He posted motivational dictates on laboratory walls that revealed his philosophy. "I don't want any damn fool in this laboratory to save money. I only want him to save time." Another read, "The best job in the world is a total failure if it is too late." Time was the only resource that mattered. Every month of delay meant more Allied ships sunk, more cities bombed, more soldiers killed by enemy aircraft that conventional anti-aircraft fire could barely touch. The National Defense Research Committee established Section T under Tuve's direction, and the project rapidly outgrew its initial facilities. By 1942, Johns Hopkins University had established the Applied Physics Laboratory in Silver Spring, Maryland, specifically to house Tuve's expanding operation. Scientists worked 16-hour shifts. Prototypes failed spectacularly. Vacuum tubes shattered under acceleration. Circuits failed at temperature extremes. Early designs detonated prematurely or not at all. But by January 1942, Tuve's team achieved a milestone that changed everything. Field tests demonstrated a 52% success rate. More than half the prototype fuses functioned correctly under combat conditions. The U.S. Navy, desperate for effective anti-aircraft defense, immediately authorized mass production before full testing was complete. It was an enormous gamble, betting hundreds of millions of dollars on a technology that was still partially experimental. But Admiral William Leahy understood what Tuve had created, a weapon that would make every American artillery piece and anti-aircraft gun 7 times more effective overnight. The proximity fuse, designated VT fuse to disguise its true variable time nature, entered production under security protocols matching the Manhattan Project. Germany and Japan could not be allowed to learn that America had created artillery shells with built-in radar. Lingerie 5th, January 5th, 1943. Waters off Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. USS Helena, a Brooklyn-class light cruiser, maintained station in the dark Pacific waters as her radar operators tracked incoming contacts. Japanese air raids had become routine, enemy bombers attempting to destroy American naval forces supporting the Marine positions ashore. What made this night different was invisible to the attacking Japanese pilots. 25% of Helena's 5-inch anti-aircraft ammunition now contained the new VT Fuzes, loaded and ready for the first combat test of Tuve's impossible weapon. At 1947 hours, an Aichi D-3A dive bomber began its attack run. Helena's gun crews opened fire, conventional shells and VT-fused rounds mixed in the barrels. A 5-inch shell arced upward, passed within 70 feet of the diving aircraft, and detonated automatically. The airburst created a spherical fragment pattern that tore through the D-3A's wings and fuselage. The bomber disintegrated, falling in flames into the Pacific. It was the first enemy aircraft in history deliberately destroyed by a near-miss explosion. The first kill by a weapon that never actually hit its target. The gun crews didn't immediately understand what they had witnessed. Hits on maneuvering targets were supposed to be rare, lucky shots. But as more Japanese aircraft attacked over the following weeks, Helena's kill rate climbed to levels that seemed statistically impossible. Admiral Arleigh Burke, commanding destroyer forces in the Solomons campaign, later wrote that mechanical time fuses only brought down a plane at night by accident. The pilot had to fly directly through the random explosion of a shell detonating at its preset time. The VT fuse transformed this lottery into targeted destruction. By mid-1943, throughout the Pacific theater, proximity-fused ammunition accounted for more than half of all Japanese aircraft shot down by naval gunfire, despite VT shells comprising only 25% of the total ammunition expended. The mathematics were undeniable. Each VT fuse shell was at least 3 times more effective than conventional ammunition, and under optimal conditions, hit rates approached 90% against aircraft that would have been nearly untouchable with mechanical fuses. Japanese pilots reported impossibly accurate American anti-aircraft fire to their commanders. Some speculated about new aiming systems, better trained gunners, or radar-directed weapons. Their intelligence services collected reports of American shells that exploded near aircraft without direct hits. But Japanese technical experts dismissed these accounts as exaggerations or misunderstandings of conventional proximity explosions. The concept of a miniature radar system compressed into an artillery shell, functioning reliably despite 20,000 g acceleration forces and 30,000 RPM spin rates, was beyond what Japanese engineers considered technologically feasible in 1943. They assumed such a device, if it existed at all, would require vacuum tubes and electronic components too fragile to survive firing. They were correct that conventional components would fail. What they didn't know was that Tuve's team had reinvented vacuum tubes from first principles, creating ruggedized designs specifically engineered to survive artillery forces. The Japanese continued developing better tactics, faster aircraft, more maneuverable fighters. They brought incremental improvements to a conventional arms race. America had changed the fundamental rules of the race itself. Intelligence fared little better. Reports from Wehrmacht units in North Africa and Italy described American anti-aircraft effectiveness that seemed inconsistent with the training levels of U.S. gunners. Some German generals attributed this to American industrial capacity. If they fired enough shells, random chance would produce adequate results. A few captured American shells were examined by German technical experts, who noted the presence of miniaturized radio equipment, but failed to comprehend the complete system's function before the shells were destroyed per Allied security protocols. The Allies maintained absolute control over VT fuse usage. Shells could only be fired over water or in circumstances where recovery by enemy forces was impossible. Not a single intact, functional VT fuse fell into Axis hands during 1943. Germany and Japan remained blind to the revolution in weapons technology that was about to devastate their forces on multiple fronts. They continued measuring warfare in traditional terms: tonnage of bombs dropped, numbers of tanks produced, training hours per pilot. They never understood that America had industrialized something far more valuable than mere quantity. America had mass-produced intelligence itself, created millions of weapons that could think. June 13th, 1944, 0418 hours. The first V-1 Vergeltungswaffe, vengeance weapon, crossed the English Channel at 400 miles per hour, its pulse jet engine producing the distinctive buzzing sound that would give it the nickname Buzz Bomb. When the engine cut out over London, the weapon fell and detonated, destroying a railway bridge in Bethnal Green and killing 6 civilians. It was the opening shot of Germany's last offensive against Britain, a campaign to break British morale through sustained terror bombing using pilotless aircraft that were cheaper and faster to produce than conventional bombers. Over the following days, launch rates escalated. By late June, more than 100 V-1s per day were being fired at London from launch sites in occupied France. British defenses, fighter aircraft, anti-aircraft guns, and barrage balloons struggled against targets that flew faster than most fighters at low altitude, were small enough to be difficult to hit, and came in such numbers that conventional interception methods were quickly overwhelmed. James Whitmore commanded a British 3.7-inch anti-aircraft battery positioned along the Channel coast, part of the defensive belt established to intercept V-1s before they reached London. During the first week of operations, his battery's success rate with conventional time-fused ammunition was devastating, in the wrong direction. 24% of V-1s engaged were destroyed. 76% continued toward London. Whitmore watched his gunners work with professional precision, calculating altitudes and speeds, setting fuses, firing at the droning buzz bombs as they passed overhead. Most shells exploded too early or too late, the mechanical time fuses unable to compensate for the V-1's speed variations as the unpiloted weapons climbed and dove erratically. "We're doing everything right," Whitmore told his second-in-command after a particularly frustrating engagement where 7 V-1s passed their position and only 1 was destroyed. "Our calculations are correct, our crews are well-trained, and we're still missing 3 out of 4. At this rate, London will be rubble by August." Then came the order. All anti-aircraft batteries defending against V-1s would receive modified American VT fuses, calibrated for the specific flight characteristics of the German cruise missiles. Expressions. Whitmore's battery received their first VT-fused ammunition for the 3.7-inch guns. American 90mm batteries along the coast were similarly equipped. The results were immediate and spectacular. Destruction rates climbed to 46%. Gunners reported that they no longer needed to perfectly estimate the V-1's position at the moment of shell burst. The VT fuses detonated automatically whenever a shell passed within effective range of the target. Near misses became kills. Week 3, 67% destruction rate. The batteries were destroying 2 out of every 3 V-1s that entered their engagement zones. German launch crews, unaware of the technological shift in British defenses, continued launching at maximum sustainable rates, sending their weapons into an increasingly lethal gauntlet. Week 4, 79% destruction rate. Whitmore stood on the battery position, watching V-1 after V-1 explode in mid-air as VT-fused shells detonated around them. 2 weeks ago, he said quietly, we were lucky to hit 1 in 4. Now we're destroying 4 out of 5. These American fuses, they've made us gods of the sky. On the final day of heavy V-1 launches against Britain, radar stations detected 104 buzz bombs crossing the Channel. British and American anti-aircraft batteries, now operating with primarily VT-fused ammunition, engaged systematically. Only 4 V-1s reached London. 100 buzz bombs, 4 penetrations. A 96% success rate against weapons that had seemed nearly unstoppable 4 weeks earlier. The campaign effectively ended. Germany continued sporadic launches, but the combination of Allied advances overrunning launch sites and the devastating effectiveness of VT-fused anti-aircraft fire had made the V-1 obsolete as a strategic weapon. German engineers examining the few unexploded Allied shells they managed to recover were baffled by the miniaturized components they found inside. Some shells were booby-trapped, or had self-destruct mechanisms that activated when examined. The Germans never fully understood the VT fuse's operating principles during the war. British reports noted an unexpected side effect of the highly sensitive fuses: occasional detonations when shells passed too close to seagulls and other large birds flying over the channel. Battery logs recorded numerous bird kills, unwitting avian casualties of radar technology sensitive enough to detect and engage airborne targets smaller than most military aircraft. The VT fuse had proven itself against Germany's vengeance weapons. The next test would come on land, where Pentagon restrictions on VT fuse usage over ground had prevented deployment due to fears of German recovery and reverse engineering. That restriction was about to be lifted under the most desperate circumstances of the Western Front War. December 16, 1944, 5:30 hours. Along an 85-mile front in Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany, 200,000 Wehrmacht soldiers, supported by nearly 600 tanks, launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, Germany's final major offensive in the West. Poor weather grounded Allied aircraft. American forces, thinly stretched along a supposedly quiet sector, reeled under the massive assault. By December 17th, German armored spearheads had penetrated 15 miles into American positions, creating a dangerous bulge in Allied lines. Entire American regiments were surrounded. Communication networks collapsed. For 48 hours, the situation appeared catastrophic. The Wehrmacht had achieved complete tactical surprise, and fog-shrouded conditions prevented the overwhelming American air superiority from affecting the battle. General Eisenhower rushed reinforcements toward the threatened sector, but ground forces would take days to arrive in sufficient strength. The Germans had created exactly the conditions they needed for success: close-quarters combat where American material superiority couldn't dominate, weather that neutralized American air power, and momentum that might be exploited before Allied reserves could stabilize the line. 18th, 1944. The Pentagon made a decision that would fundamentally alter the battle's trajectory. For 2 years, American military leadership had absolutely prohibited the use of VT fuses over land, terrified that German forces would recover intact examples and reverse engineer the technology. The standing order was unambiguous. VT fuses could only be fired over water or in circumstances where recovery was impossible. Now, faced with Germany's last desperate offensive threatening to split Allied armies and possibly reach Antwerp, the critical port supplying the entire Allied advance, Pentagon leadership lifted the embargo within 48 hours of the German attack's start. The gamble was enormous. If German engineers captured functional VT fuses and successfully reverse-engineered them, the technological advantage would be lost. But if American forces didn't stop the Wehrmacht breakthrough immediately, the consequences would be even more catastrophic. Artillery units received urgent orders. VT-fused ammunition was authorized for ground targets. Use it freely. Stop the German advance. The technical parameters for ground use differed from anti-aircraft applications. Artillery officers calibrated VT-fused shells to detonate 30 to 50 feet above ground level, high enough to clear terrain features and provide optimal fragment dispersion, low enough to maximize casualty effects against troops and light vehicles. The physics of airburst artillery had been understood for centuries. Explosions above ground create fragment patterns that spread downward and outward, covering far larger areas than ground-burst explosions and penetrating foxholes, trenches, and light fortifications that would protect against traditional impacts. What made VT fuses revolutionary was eliminating the need for time fuses. Traditional airburst artillery required gunners to calculate the exact time of flight to target, set mechanical fuses accordingly, and hope their calculations accounted for all variables. VT fuses made the process automatic. Every shell would detonate at optimal height above whatever target it encountered, without requiring perfect gunnery calculations. The shells had become self-aware weapons that could find their own best detonation point. Artillery battalions began receiving VT-fused shells on December 19th. The effect on German forces was immediate and psychologically devastating. Wehrmacht soldiers who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front, veterans of Stalingrad, Kursk, and countless desperate battles, reported encountering something worse than Soviet artillery. Soviet shells, however numerous and powerful, followed predictable patterns. They exploded on impact. Trenches provided protection. Forests offered concealment. Basic infantry tactics developed over decades of modern warfare remained valid. American VT-fused artillery destroyed these assumptions. Shells exploded overhead without warning. The projectiles traveled faster than sound, so there was no whistling approach to signal incoming fire. Foxholes became traps instead of shelters. Forest cover that should have concealed positions now channeled fragments downward onto troops below. Every explosion occurred at precisely the altitude that maximized casualties against infantry, and the Americans were firing these shells by the thousands. German units attempting to dig in and hold defensive positions discovered they were simply targets, waiting for the next airburst barrage that would kill them in their holes. Wehrmacht tactical doctrine, refined through 5 years of war, had no answer for weapons that saw through earth and trees, that found the optimal killing altitude automatically, that arrived without warning and struck from above where there was no protection. Klaus Hoffmann and his surviving men would learn this lesson in blood over the following days, as American artillery transformed the Ardennes forests from defensive positions into killing zones. 22nd, 1944. Klaus Hoffmann's platoon, reduced from 40 men to 12 survivors, occupied a hastily prepared position 3 kilometers northwest of Bastogne. The American 101st Airborne Division held the town itself, surrounded but unbroken. Hoffmann's orders were simple: prevent American relief forces from reaching Bastogne. His experience said this was achievable. His men were veterans, the terrain favored defense, and American forces would have to attack across open ground. But experience was proving worthless against American artillery that refused to obey the laws of conventional warfare. At 13:20 hours, American guns began firing. Hoffmann heard no warning sounds. The first indication of incoming fire was explosions overhead, airburst after airburst detonating precisely 20 to 30 meters above ground. Each explosion created a spherical fragment pattern that covered a circle 75 feet in diameter. There was no safe angle, no dead ground, no protection. Hoffmann watched Schütze Müller, a 18-year-old who had survived 3 weeks of combat, die instantly when fragments from an overhead burst tore through his position. They've made the sky our enemy, Hoffmann thought, pressing himself uselessly against the frozen earth. On the Eastern Front, we could survive Soviet artillery by digging deep enough, stay low, wait for the barrage to end, then emerge and fight. But these shells, they're designed to kill us in our holes. They know exactly where to explode to reach us. The technical reality of VT fuses was beyond Hoffmann's comprehension, but the tactical implications were brutally clear. Every traditional infantry defensive technique had been rendered obsolete by weapons that automatically found the optimal killing altitude. The Americans weren't firing more artillery than the Soviets. German soldiers noted that American barrages used fewer shells. But each American shell was impossibly more effective, as if every round was guided by a genius gunner who calculated the perfect burst height for maximum casualties. By 1500 hours, Hoffmann's 12 men had been reduced to 6. No American infantry had yet attacked. The Americans were simply using artillery to erase German positions with mathematical precision, destroying defenders without risking assault troops. Redhead head. From December 18th through the end of January 1945, American forces fired hundreds of thousands of VT-fused shells against German positions throughout the Ardennes. The effect on Wehrmacht combat effectiveness went beyond simple casualty figures. German infantry units refused to occupy forward positions where American artillery observation was possible. Officers reported catastrophic morale degradation. Soldiers would accept almost any casualties from direct combat, but the psychological impact of artillery that killed without warning from above, against which there was no defense or shelter, broke veteran units. Wehrmacht tactical formations began dissolving. Units that should have held defensive positions for days retreated after hours under VT-fused bombardment. The offensive momentum that Germany had achieved through surprise and concentration of forces evaporated within 1 week. Proximity-fused artillery didn't just kill German soldiers, it destroyed the Wehrmacht's ability to function as a coherent military force. By December 26th, American forces had stabilized the Bulge. By January 1945, the German offensive had completely failed. General George S. Patton, commanding Third Army during the relief of Bastogne, later wrote assessment that captured the VT Fuze's impact in characteristically blunt language. The funny Fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. Analysis of casualty reports supported Patton's conclusion. German losses from VT-fused artillery were 5 to 7 times higher per shell fired compared to conventional ammunition. From December 1944 through April 1945, as American forces advanced into Germany, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire destroyed over 1,000 German aircraft, at a time when the Luftwaffe was already nearly destroyed as an effective force. The VT Fuse achieved what strategic bombing, tactical air power, and conventional artillery had struggled to accomplish. It made Wehrmacht tactical doctrines suicidal. German generals who had developed sophisticated defensive tactics against conventional weapons discovered that all their expertise was worthless against artillery shells that could see, decide optimal burst altitude, and detonate automatically. They were fighting yesterday's war with yesterday's tactics against tomorrow's weapons. Klaus Hoffmann and his men bombardments in Belgium. American factories were producing 70,000 proximity fuses every single day. More than 100 American companies contributed to VT Fuse production. Crosley Corporation, RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, McQuay Norris Manufacturing, Sylvania Electric, supported by over 2,000 suppliers and subcontractors providing specialized components. The scale of production reflected American industrial philosophy. If a weapon provided tactical advantage, manufacture it in quantities that guaranteed overwhelming superiority. Germany produced 1,347 Tiger tanks during the entire war, each a masterpiece of engineering representing hundreds of hours of skilled labor. America produced 22 million VT Fuses, more than 16,000 smart weapons for every German Tiger tank. This wasn't a war between armies. This was industrial civilization warfare, where production capacity mattered more than individual weapon quality. A VT Fuse production revealed the power of American mass manufacturing. In 1942, early production models cost $732 per fuse, expensive but acceptable for critical anti-aircraft defense. By 1943, improved manufacturing processes and economies of scale had reduced costs to approximately $100 per unit. By 1945, mass production had driven the price down to $18 per fuse. The technology inside hadn't changed significantly. Miniaturized vacuum tubes, radio transmitters, Doppler detection circuitry remained fundamentally similar to 1942 prototypes. What changed was American industry's ability to manufacture complex electronics at scales never previously attempted. The VT Fuse program represented one of the first mass production applications of printed circuits, a technique that would revolutionize electronics manufacturing after the war. Workers who had never built radios before were producing miniature radar systems by the thousands per shift, using assembly line techniques adapted from automobile manufacturing. Total program cost reached approximately $1 billion in 1940s currency, equivalent to roughly $15 billion in 2021 economic terms. Only the Manhattan Project and B-29 bomber program consumed more resources among American wartime technology initiatives. But unlike the atomic bomb, which ended the war through 2 catastrophic demonstrations of power, the VT Fuse provided continuous tactical advantage across multiple theaters and missions from January 1943 through war's end. Vannevar Bush, head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development that coordinated Allied weapons research, later assessed the VT Fuse's impact in 3 categories: 7-fold increased effectiveness against Japanese kamikaze attacks in the Pacific, neutralization of V-1 attacks against England, and fundamental transformation of land warfare tactics beginning at the Battle of the Bulge. Admiral Arleigh Burke calculated that VT Fuse technology shortened the war by approximately 1 year, saving hundreds of thousands of American lives and preventing millions of additional casualties among Allied and civilian populations. Security protocols around VT Fuse production matched Manhattan Project levels. Workers manufacturing components often didn't know what final weapon they were creating. Complete fuses were only assembled at secure facilities under military guard. The designation VT Fuse was deliberately misleading, officially standing for variable time, to suggest an improved mechanical fuse rather than the actual revolutionary radar proximity technology. Shells containing VT fuses were marked with special codes and handled under strict protocols. Standing orders throughout 1943 to 1944 prohibited firing VT-fused ammunition over land where German forces might recover intact examples. The security measures succeeded. Germany and Japan never obtained functional VT fuses to reverse engineer during the war. German technical intelligence knew American shells contained some form of improved fusing mechanism, but they never comprehended the miniature radar system that made proximity detonation automatic. Japanese forces in the Pacific reported American anti-aircraft effectiveness that seemed statistically impossible, but attributed this to superior training and fire control systems, rather than revolutionary ammunition. Both Axis powers continued developing incremental improvements to conventional weapons, while America had fundamentally redefined what was possible in artillery technology. Genuous Improvements, 25th, 1945. Klaus Hoffmann, commanding 7 survivors from his original 40-man platoon, surrendered to American forces near Houffalize, Belgium. The Ardennes offensive had collapsed. German casualties exceeded 100,000 killed, wounded, and captured. American forces were advancing into Germany itself. As American military police processed the German prisoners, Hoffmann observed the endless columns of American supply trucks moving forward: fuel, ammunition, rations, replacement vehicles. A logistics network that seemed to have no limit. An American captain who spoke adequate German conducted the initial interrogation. "You fought well, Sergeant," the captain said without hostility, "but you never had a chance." Hoffmann, exhausted and defeated, asked the question that had haunted him since December 18th. "Your artillery shells, the ones that exploded in the air above us, how many of those did you have?" The captain smiled. "Millions. We made them faster than you could count them." Hoffmann understood then what he had been fighting. Not an army, but an entire industrial civilization mobilized for war. Post-war analysis confirmed what Hoffmann had glimpsed through exhaustion and terror. Admiral Lewis Strauss, who had worked on proximity fuse development, wrote, "While no one invention won the war, the proximity fuse must be listed among the very small group of developments, such as radar, upon which victory very largely depended." The VT fuse hadn't achieved the dramatic, war-ending impact of the atomic bomb, but it provided continuous tactical advantage across every theater where it was employed. Japanese kamikaze attacks that should have devastated American carrier groups were blunted by anti-aircraft fire that achieved hit rates approaching 90%. Impossible with conventional fuses. V-1 buzz bombs that should have terrorized London into submission were destroyed at 79% rates, making the vengeance weapon campaign strategically irrelevant. Wehrmacht defensive tactics that should have made every river, forest, and town a costly obstacle were shattered by artillery that eliminated the fundamental concept of cover and concealment. The VT fuse extended far beyond World War II. The miniaturization techniques developed to compress radar systems into artillery shells laid foundations for post-war electronics. The mass production of printed circuits, pioneered for VT fuse manufacturing, became standard for the electronics industry. The concept of smart weapons that could detect, decide, and destroy targets automatically evolved into modern precision-guided munitions. But perhaps most significantly, the VT fuse demonstrated a philosophical principle that defined Cold War military doctrine. Advanced technology, mass-produced by industrial democracies, could overcome numerical advantages and tactical brilliance. The Soviet Union learned this lesson, observing American VT Fuse effectiveness, driving their own massive investments in weapons technology and electronics. The arms race of the following decades traced its intellectual origins partly to the proximity fuse, the weapon that proved technology could be more decisive than courage, that made thinking weapons more valuable than brave soldiers. German engineers examining captured VT fuses after the war expressed stunned admiration for the miniaturization and ruggedization achievements. They had attempted similar development. German researchers created crude acoustic and photoelectric proximity fuses, but never achieved the reliability, cost-effectiveness, or production scale necessary for combat deployment. Germany's industrial base, strained by Allied bombing and resource shortages, couldn't support the kind of mass production that made VT fuses tactically decisive. Germany could build sophisticated weapons in small numbers. America built sophisticated weapons by the millions. The arithmetic of industrial warfare was unforgiving. 22 million proximity fuses versus 1,347 Tiger tanks. Democracy and capitalism, when fully mobilized, had demonstrated the ability to manufacture intelligence itself, creating weapons that thought faster and more consistently than human gunners, that never tired, never panicked, never missed due to fear or confusion. The Wehrmacht measured military effectiveness in courage, training, and tactical brilliance. America measured effectiveness in production rates, cost per unit, and hit percentages. In total war between industrial powers, production always defeats courage. The proximity fuse proved this principle with mathematical certainty. Klaus Hoffmann survived the war, returned to Germany in 1946, lived until 1987. Occasionally, until the end of his life, when he heard thunder or distant explosions, he would instinctively look upward, searching the sky for shells that exploded without warning. The psychological scars of fighting an enemy whose weapons were smarter than their targets never fully healed. He told his grandchildren stories about the war, carefully edited for young audiences, but sometimes he would pause mid-sentence and say something that confused them. We brought experience and courage to that war. The Americans brought arithmetic. In the end, arithmetic always wins. The proximity fuse had taught him what modern warfare truly meant. Not heroism against heroism, but industrial capacity against industrial capacity. And in that contest, Nazi Germany, for all its tactical genius, for all its soldiers' courage, for all its engineers' brilliance, had never possessed even a fraction of the industrial power necessary to defeat an opponent who could manufacture 22 million thinking weapons, while Germany struggled to build a few thousand tanks. The secret weapon that saved D-Day and decimated the Wehrmacht wasn't just a technological achievement. It was a demonstration that free societies, when threatened, could organize, innovate, and manufacture at scales totalitarian regimes couldn't match. The VT fuse represented democracy's answer to fascism, not propaganda or ideology, but mathematics, engineering, and the cold efficiency of industrial capitalism, producing smart weapons faster than any enemy could destroy them.